Let me pick up on one thing then, which is this distinction between outcomes or objectives and determinants. And even if the outcomes are broad and maybe hard to pin down, I mean, do we need to differentiate or be able to differentiate between what we are trying to achieve and what we think leads to that goal?
Health outcomes, which are usually seen as specific rates of illness and disease and life expectancy and things like that, are very difficult to tie directly to a social determinant. Making a link, for example, between adequate housing and diabetes is almost impossible in terms of how you get data that directly links those two things. So we're often having to kind of extrapolate and make those logical links. We know that housing and transportation and all the things I mentioned before do relate to health incomes, but we sometimes need to go through different channels in terms of data and evidence to see those outcomes. It can be a stretch to show those links, but we do know that they're there.
Of course, there are a lot of good things that are tied to the social determinants of health and public health, for example, that are beneficial to people. But the prominence of those issues relative to the other choices that we're making and the degree to which they actually change the systems and the mindsets that are driving the hurt that exists in society aren't nearly strong enough to bring about a fundamental kind of change towards something that ensures the quality of life for everyone, in my view. I'm excited about the way in which objective well-being and the determinant sort of approach complement that kind of an approach. And if I could, not to sound critical about it, but we've been analyzing happiness for decades, and it has not really made it into the mainstream of public policy in any country, except for Bhutan as a reasonable exception and with an asterisk, in any reasonable way. And public policy leaders aren't focused on those kinds of issues. What they're focused on are, to the extent that they get to the social issues, housing, health, education, child poverty, and related issues, and without us being able to sort of marry up who's being left behind, really valuable ways, and we've been able to do this with our tools, who amongst Nova Scotia residents are unhappy, who don't have meaning in their life. And when we do that, we actually come up with some really interesting new insights about human relationships, social connectedness, mental health, time adequacy, and things that aren't getting the kind of attention that they deserve. So really helpful and important ways to begin the conversation, but it's not where everybody is. So with what we're doing with our analysis around objective well-being, we're saying, okay, well, let's begin to look at the ways in which profiles of people and certain questions are really holding others back. And we snack at both the outcomes and the determinant side of that buffet because we think they're both important. They both feed off of each other. And as you know, I'm less interested in the differences than I am in the complementary nature of them.
When we developed the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing, we aimed for a focus on what we call status indicators. Very simply, we describe this as indicators of the state of children that can be observed in children or reported by children. We didn't use the term outcomes because so often outcomes are nested. One outcome leads to another. And the determinants of children's well-being, as for adults, are really, nested in a very big ecosystem of influences from political paradigms and policy choices, culture and social norms, to genetics and family conditions. And if we start with children's well-being status, again, what we can see in children, what they say about their lives, it's a good basis to work backwards and then understand what is shaping that. And the complexity of determinants, tends to get very difficult to measure, and it tends to get lost or overly simplified in measurement constructs. And we tend to focus in that case on the most proximal determinants, like family characteristics or what's going on in communities and what choices communities can make to support children. And that is problematic. You know, we have to be really careful about what we're measuring. When we measure and build determinants into measurement frameworks, we have to recognize that, frankly, policy choices are some of the most important shapers of children's well-being. And I think I would end that question by saying that children themselves can really help us understand what are the determinants of their status, their well-being, and they should be engaged in making sense of data and identifying the patterns that we're seeing in measurement frameworks. We've seen through our work that it's a really important aspect of understanding well-being and its determinants.